So this morning, just to remind you, we're continuing with our series of sermons out of John's Gospel. And each of our sermons is based on an encounter that Jesus had with various people and how that encounter changed their lives forever. And today we're in chapter 11, and we'll be seeing Jesus' encounter with his friend Lazarus and his sisters Martha and Mary. Now, until this week, when I was driving past Doncaster Racecourse and I looked up, and obviously this story was on my mind because I needed to prepare a sermon. And lo and behold, as I looked up, I'd never seen this before. I saw what you can see in the picture there. I saw the name of Lazarus. Now, his name is displayed prominently at the racecourse, but unfortunately, it's not the Bible character that is being advertised, but it's the racecourse sponsors, who happen to be a property company called Lazarus. So, moving away from Lazarus, the property company, to Lazarus, the Bible character, we're going to read the story of the encounter. And we'll see that this encounter with Lazarus is not really just about Jesus' encounter with Lazarus, but it's an encounter with three members of the same family, Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. And we're going to pick up the story in verse 17 through to 44. So I'm going to read that now. On Jesus' arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is come into the world. That's episode 1 with Martha. After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and he is asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now, Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? And then the final episode of the story. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there for 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." It's an amazing story, isn't it? An amazing miracle. You know, some people go to great lengths to try to turn back the aging clock. Through diet, through cosmetic surgery, lifestyle changes, and even, as the picture shows, regularly bathing in ice cold water. I couldn't think of anything that turns me off more, but it is said by some to increase your life expectancy. And yet, whatever you may do, I guarantee one thing: you will die. One day, our bodies will fail and you and I will die. Every single person living on this planet can be certain of this thing. It's 100% certainty. In fact, way back, as you'll see on the screen, way back in 1789, the American Ben Franklin wrote this: "In this world, nothing is certain except death and taxes." And we probably know all about the second one, but death is certain. And in this eyewitness account, we see Jesus reversing the iron grip of death. This man Lazarus, who'd been dead for 4 days, is brought back to life. And as I pointed out as we were reading it, this story is told in 3 episodes. If this were a TV drama, episode 1, Martha meets Jesus. Episode 2, Mary meets Jesus. Episode 3, the climax, Lazarus meets Jesus. So each episode involves one of the members of this family, Lazarus and his 2 sisters, and their encounter with Jesus. And the first episode is covered in verses 17 through to 27. And what we see in these verses is Martha's trust and faith in Jesus being challenged. It was lovely, that song that we sang at the beginning, and what Abner said to us. How our faith can be challenged. How God doesn't seem to be working. And yet we know God at the right time will work. And hearing Jesus is on his way, Martha goes out to meet him. And Martha greets Jesus with a phrase that must have been frequently on the lips of the family. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Lazarus was so sick and you weren't here. If only you'd been here." They're words of regret from Martha. "I just wish you'd been here." But Jesus tells her that her brother will rise again. And what Martha says in reply is, yes, I know my brother will rise again. Yeah, he'll rise again one day in the distant future, on the last day. As already Chris has reminded us, on that last day when the world as we know it will end, the end of this age, and we will all rise to be confronted and meet face to face with Jesus. But you see, Martha's faith is for the future. It's not for the present moment. She's looking forward to the final resurrection at the end of the age. She's not expecting a miracle in the present. Perhaps you may recognize a similar challenge to your own faith. You know, we may know that God has worked in our lives in the past. And we know that he'll work again in the future. But do we have faith to believe that he can act to deal with our problems in the present? The problems that are here right now. And Jesus directs Martha to think away from the future to the present moment. And he says those words to us, perhaps some of the greatest words we find in Scripture. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He doesn't say, I was the resurrection and the life, but I'm not anymore. And he doesn't say, I will be the resurrection and the life sometime in the future. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. Right now, I am. It's a way Jesus is saying, God is here right now. He is here in the here and now. And that's where our faith needs to be. Faith for the here and now. Faith for the present moment. It's faith which is tested because the situation is right now. It's right now. And as Abner reminded us, and as we sang in that first song, Jesus' timing is always perfect, and he acts so that God the Father will be glorified. Jesus assures us that for those who believe in him, there is abundant resurrection life, both before and after physical death. It is now, and it will be even greater on that day that we meet him face to face. Jesus has come to bring abundant life right now to those who believe. It's a life that cannot be destroyed by death. Jesus has authority over death. And he will demonstrate that when we get to episode 3, the raising of Lazarus. And as believers, we do not need to fear death because physical death is not the end. This is the promise of the gospel. But there is one condition, and it's there, where Jesus says, do you believe this? Do you believe this? That I am the resurrection of the life. Put your trust in me right now. Do you believe this? That's the condition. And it's the challenge to Martha's faith, and it's the challenge to our own faith for our own situations. And Martha says, yes, Lord, I believe. You are the Messiah. You are the Son of God. Now, her faith can be wobbly. We see it wobbly even in episode 3 of the story. But she shows a stronger, clearer trust and commitment to the person of Jesus. than she did at the start of this episode. And Jesus challenges Martha's faith, and he challenges our own faith for the present moment. So let's move on now to the second episode. And this involves Martha's sister Mary. And it's covered in verses 28 through to 37. And here we see Jesus sharing in the grief of Mary. Mary's grief is shared by Jesus. It's so interesting how Mary greets Jesus with exactly the same words that her sister Martha did. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Mary is in tears. She's overwhelmed with grief and sorrow. And in this episode, we see something of the heart of Jesus. We see Jesus in his full humanity. Jesus is angry, not at the family. We'll see what Jesus is angry about in a minute. But Jesus is angry and Jesus is sad. He's angry and he's sad. We read in verse 33 that Jesus was deeply moved in spirit and troubled when he sees what heartbreaking sorrow death creates in family and friends. Those words translated in the NIV is Jesus was deeply moved. In some of the older translations, it said Jesus groaned. Jesus groaned. Neither of those translations are perhaps grasp fully the true meaning of those words, deeply moved. It expresses in the original language anger and indignation. It's used as an expression for the snorting of a horse. Now, I've pictured it as a roaring lion, a lion that is angry. Jesus is angry at death and its consequences. He's angry at the suffering and the sadness and the pain that it brings in a fallen world. And as we know, only Jesus could deal with that when he died on the cross and rose again. But Jesus, in his humanity, is angry at the consequences of death in a fallen world. But more than just being angry, Jesus is moved to tears. In verse 35, we read, Jesus wept. It's the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. And it's perhaps the most moving and poignant of verses. Jesus wept. Jesus shares Martha's grief. And that's such a wonderful application for our own lives, isn't it? When we're burdened and sad, when we're brought low and troubled, when we're struggling and running on empty, Jesus weeps with us. He enters into our suffering and our loss. Our grief is his grief. Our pain is his pain. Our sadness is his sadness. Our tears are on his face. The Bible tells us that right now, Jesus is seated at the right hand of the Father. Jesus, who died, who rose, and who is ascended into heaven. He sits at the right hand of the Father. And what is he doing right now? Paul in Romans chapter 8, verse 34 says, Jesus, who sits at the right hand of the Father, is praying. He is interceding for you and for me. We are not forgotten. Jesus is with us in our suffering, our sadness, and our sorrow. What an amazing truth that is in this story. So finally, we move to the third episode of the story, covered in verses 38 to 44. And we see the miracle of the life of Lazarus restored. Jesus offers more than comfort to the family. He acts to change the situation. And you know, this story of the raising of Lazarus is one of the most popular stories in Christian art. It's probably been depicted more than any other Bible story. Here are just two artists who have depicted this story. The one on the left is a modern picture. It's a picture from the 1960s. The one on the right is 400 years older. It's a Caravaggio picture of the raising of Lazarus. It's a much busier picture. But you know, in the catacombs in Rome, where the earliest Christians are buried, do you know there are over 55 wall paintings of the raising of Lazarus? This was a story that gripped the early Christians. That there is life after death and life before death, abundant life. And Jesus calls Lazarus out of the tomb, and his life is restored. And when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, he showed that he has power over death. Jesus brings life where once there was only death. And as we know, it points forward to Jesus' own death and resurrection, the greatest of all miracles. And it's no coincidence in John's gospel that this story comes smack in the middle of the gospel, chapter 11, halfway through. And what now follows in John's gospel is the road to the cross and the resurrection of Jesus. And in this final verse, verse 44, we read that Lazarus he's being set free in terms of he's back to life, but he's still got all these bandages wrapped around him. He's still bound tight with these linen cloths. We can see that in the left-hand picture. Must have been a bit scary, mustn't it? A person coming out of the tomb, looking like a mummy, wrapped, his head would have been wrapped, and his body wrapped, restricting his movement. And Jesus calls the people to unwrap the bandages and set him fully free. And I was thinking, isn't that a picture of how we can be, even now in the here and now, bound up by things which limit and confine us? And Jesus wants to set us free. Free from the sins that may bind us. Free from the fears that may hold us back and stifle us as individuals and as a congregation together. Set us free from the insecurities that may hold us back and grip us. And God calls us to come out and be set free. So, the 3 episodes, let's just have the recap, as it were. So as we end, There are challenges for us, aren't there? The challenge of growing in our trust in Jesus as Martha's trust grew. And may we be encouraged by Jesus' compassion and concern for Mary, because it's exactly the same compassion and concern for you and for me. And may we be strengthened by this amazing truth that Jesus is the resurrection and the life giver and restorer, not just for Lazarus, but for you and for me, if only we believe. That's the condition. There is abundant life for those who believe in Jesus. Amen.